Yeah, let me start by welcoming you all to another juxtaposition lecture of the Berlin University of the Arts on contemporary cultural production. My name is Lukas Feireiss, and as part of my visiting professorship here at the school, I promote and I pilot more, let's say, transdisciplinary, intellectual, and creative post-protocol discourse by inviting various artists and designers and architects and thinkers and curators alike from all around the world to talk about their hybrid and often heterogeneous professional practices. And this weekly format understands itself as a somewhat open educational platform to also to challenge and negotiate, let's say, conventional classifications and categories in the worlds of arts and academia, and promote a more free-floating intelligence and a more, let's say, wild thinking. And as the title already suggests, at the heart of this series is therefore a creative juxtaposition, also a juxtaposition that embraces ambivalences and complexities, diversities, contradictions, cross-pollinations, and collaborations. And today, I'm super excited to have curator and critic Nicolas Bourriaud with us. Thank you so much for being here, Nicolas. Nicolas Bourriaud is one of the premier intellects in the fields of contemporary art and philosophy, actually for more than 3 decades now. He was the co-founder of the Palais de Tokyo in Paris. He was curator for contemporary art at Tate Britain, director of l'École nationale supérieure des Beaux-Arts in Paris, the artistic director of the Contemporary Art Center in Montpellier. And already at the age of 25, he curated the French Pavilion at the Venice Biennial in 1990, that was. And I believe a couple of years later, in 1993, you created a section of the Venice Biennale, and ever since did like one landmark exhibition after the other. He also curated the Moscow Biennial in 2005 and 2007, the Tate Triennial in 2009, the Athens Biennial in 2011, the Taipei Biennial in 2014, the Kaunas Biennial in Lithuania in 2015, and the 2017 Istanbul Biennial. It's an incredible lineup already. We have been for the first time in touch a couple of years ago when I was working on a publication, a reader that summed up all the texts that inspired me to run a transdisciplinary master program at the Sandberg Institute in Amsterdam. It was called Radical Cutter. This is the book. And you agreed to publish the introduction of your seminal work, Postproduction, in this book. But I have to admit, it's a bit of almost like a fanboy moment here, because you are something like an intellectual mentor to me, even though we've never met in person. And I think as a thinker and a curator, you have definitely influenced my personal and professional development in a very massive way, because you are in many regards the personification of the notion of curation as an open-ended intellectual interrogation and processual, so process-based philosophical discourse too, in trying to come to terms with the world we live in through the lens of the arts. And when I say come to terms, I literally mean it, because every few years, Bourriaud coins a new term as part of his ongoing, like spiral-like explorations that changes how we look at the arts, creates a new terminology that offers a possible interpretation of the complexity of contemporary artistic practices, and proposes whole new cartographies of knowledge. So from Relational Aesthetics in 1998 to Postproduction, I believe in 2002, and from the Radicant in 2008 and Ultramodern to the X-Form, now coming this year in English, Inclusions. There are only a few curators on this level, star curators in the world, and he is one of them. Whilst most of them focus on curation, you keep writing and publishing theoretical works at the same time. So a long introduction, but thank you so much for accepting my invitation to speak to us as part of the Juxtaposition lecture series. It's a huge honor. So welcome, Nicolas Bourriaud.
Thank you, Lukas, for this introduction. I'm very happy to talk to the UDK students today for many reasons. You mentioned a series of exhibitions I actually made for quite a fucking long time now. You're right, but I always define myself as a curator who writes. Actually, I'm not a philosopher, and my thoughts are actually literally coming from the studios and the exhibitions. I would define myself more as a translator in a way, but without the proximity of the artist, there's nothing to think for me, because I don't take my references or my models into classical philosophy. I'm trying literally to be a curator who writes. And for me, these two activities have been always connected one to another. I always say that when I have a question, I make an exhibition. And when I start getting a few answers to those questions, I start writing. But it's a kind of ongoing process, and the writings also lead me to other exhibitions. So it's a kind of a back and forth, which is vital for me. Actually, I wouldn't be able to do just one of these two activities.
And do they speak the same language to you? So when you develop an exhibition and when you're writing a book, or is it a slightly different grammar?
It's two different grammars, actually. It's difficult to find a metaphor for it, but when I write, I'm using common grammar, which is the mainly French grammar, and obviously an exhibition is based on a very different grammar. It's a visual grammar, a formal grammar, and you cannot duplicate the way you think verbally into an exhibition. It would be a major mistake for me. So obviously, any exhibition produces new interrogations. They produce every time new ideas, actually. Things I hadn't thought about before, because it literally comes from the artworks. That's why curating has a grammar, but this grammar has nothing to do with the verbal grammar, and no exhibition should be illustrating any idea. And I very thoroughly try to curate exhibitions which don't illustrate any idea, but generate things with the help of the artworks, actually.
And do you, before you start with your lecture, a few questions ahead, but do you explore several issues at the same time that sometimes merge into one another? Or while others maybe expand into different directions? How do I have to imagine that?
It expands. I can give you an example. For example, in 2014, I curated the Taipei Biennial. And actually, it was the first big biennial devoted to the Anthropocene at the time, 2014. It was actually a show at the house, the Culturelle that developed in end of 2013, actually, that I had seen. It was very different. But at the time, biennials were not so much concerned by this kind of topics. So I opened a kind of cycle of exhibitions here in Taipei, which prolongated in a show called Crash Test in Montpellier at the beginning of 2018. And then end of 2019, I curated the Seventh Continent in Istanbul. Now, actually, I'm preparing an exhibition in Venice, which will happen during the whole duration of the Venice Biennial. It's a 7-month exhibition. It's a crazy thing. And it's going to be divided in 3 parts, 3 acts, like an opera, if you want. And it's an exhibition that, in a way, sums up many ideas coming from the three previous ones, but in a totally different level, because the notion which is involved in this future exhibition, which is going to open at the end of April this year, is the notion of the sublime, actually, but a de-romanticized sublime. It's not talking about Caspar David Friedrich exactly. I'm talking about a sublime that we all experience now, which is actually related to the fact that the atmosphere itself has become a threat. And Edmund Burke defined the sublime in his book in 1755 or 7, I don't remember, by saying that sublime is a feeling of pleasure, delight, he called that, mixed with fear. And this fear, is much related to climate change today. This fear is a fear that we all actually, to different degrees, can experience today, because the environment, the human environment, has become a threat in a way, and by our own makings, by the way. So the sublime, as a notion, as an aesthetic notion, finds new actuality now. Actually, it's a very it's very much related to the present times for me, and that's why I try to build up this exhibition around this aesthetics of immersion, the fact that we feel immersed in the world, and being immersed creates, and that's what I wanted to talk a little bit today about, produces a new feeling of space and space-time, actually. And this has repercussions on the artist's works. And this is a very fascinating evolution today, actually. Both fascinating and also preoccupying, obviously, because we are facing huge changes today in the way we can see the world, we can envision it, we can imagine the future, etc., etc.
Yeah, beautiful. Maybe we can actually take this as a cue to kind of end your talk. I think you will also speak about this exhibition and your current research on, or the book that's coming up called Inclusions.
We'll try to explain, why it's called Inclusions, but you have a few clues here. But maybe, so as I started talking about this, maybe I'm going to change a little bit my notes and start with it, actually. What's the space which is defined by the Capitalocene? Actually, I prefer to talk about Capitalocene than Anthropocene, because it's not the human beings as a species which actually transform the climate today. It's an economic system. It's a way of producing, actually. So, as humans are not equal in this regard, it's quite unfair to call it Anthropocene, And I take the word which was coined by Andreas Malm, the Swedish writer, of Capitalocene, which seems much more accurate to me. So let's start with this, actually. What are the new parameters for today? And I'm talking about it because it modifies today's aesthetics. It modifies the way artists see the world and represent it, obviously, or address it in a more general way. So the first thing that defines the Capitalocene is the fact that areas which were formerly separate are coming closer. There's a promiscuity today which is absolutely striking between the different spheres, the sphere of the vegetal, the animal, the mineral, the molecular, the social, the machinic. All of this become one big thing. We cannot separate anymore, the human species and all those elements which were actually separate in our way of seeing the world before. In Western philosophy, it was completely separate. But we know now that the apparition of a bacteria in the center of China can completely change our way of behaving in Berlin or Paris. We know now that if we eat for breakfast certain types of chocolate paste, it modifies the Malaysian forests. I'm talking about those promiscuities. Everything is interconnected, and whatever we do, it has an impact. And what the human beings have discovered through what was called then the Anthropocene, at the beginning of the 2000s, what they discovered through this is the impact of their actions upon the world. And this impact is distributed in many ways on the planet. And what we see now is the fact that everything is close to us. There's no distance anymore. And that's what the first point I wanted to talk about. There's a crisis in the notion of distance today. The way we spatialize things is completely collapsing. And I would define the Capitalocene as a series of new foldings. Actually, it's like when you actually take a piece of paper and you shatter it, then you see you have points which were not connected one to another before, which become connected. It's the mathematician René Thom, who wrote the theory of catastrophe, and catastrophe is exactly what this new foldings. It's a very interesting idea. So what's happening too is that every limit has become porous. Actually, this promiscuity is also a material promiscuity. Through the foldings that I just talked about, a remote dot on the map may prove closer, actually, than some suburbs which are actually a few miles away, for example. What the result of these new foldings and this new promiscuity is the multiplication of what could be called the butterfly effects, in a way, kind of catastrophic, happenings all over the planet today. It's concerning economy as much as meteorology. It's the butterfly effect is reigning completely on our world. So this crisis in the notion of distance is even something more important than that. It provokes a crisis of the human scale, in a way. And I think that's the main point. The fact that what we knew as a position of the human beings in the world is completely shattered. There's a huge crisis of the human scale because the human being cannot longer bestow a privileged position in this planet, not even a specific scale. And this clashes completely with all the typical Western representations that we can find in museums, which is you have a figure on a background. And more deeply, actually, I think that's this pattern, which is actually, the more in crisis at the moment. Figure on a background. It actually is linked to this collapsing of the human space today on a political and geopolitical and geological level. Art history shows what, in the Western world, human beings distinctly cut out from their natural environment, representations where nature is no more than scenery, if you want, kind of theater that mankind is supposed to master and arrange the way they want. Ideologies are always linked with modes of representation, and this one is a kind of hidden ideology which starts, and I'm going to talk about it a bit later, way before even Christianism. What's important to note at this point is the Capitalocene as a global consciousness today shows the global proximity that's generated by capitalism on an atmospheric, geological, economical level. Anat Singh, the Canadian academic who wrote this amazing book about the mushroom of the end of the world, that you certainly may have seen. Anat Singh says that what is typical of our times is the fact that for many species today, there's no escape, actually. It's promiscuity again. Saturation of the space, densification of the human settlements produce the fact that there is no space for species. Think about just what happened in Australia recently with the huge fires, but not only. This is a dramatic historical moment, because I really believe that, and I'm going to develop this idea, that the art as a phenomenon, if we talk about it, is linked with distance. It's not the only thing which is linked to distance, but the way art has been experienced since the first paintings in the caves, actually in the prehistoric times, till now, it could not exist without this distance, actually. Think about the definition of the aura of an artwork by Walter Benjamin, for example. He defined it as the unique apparition of a faraway situation or object, actually. Apparition, unique, and something which is far away. And that's the far away which is more important here, actually, because there's no far away anymore, in a way. This promiscuity that I described at the beginning destroys the possibility of the far away. So what's going on? There's a name for it, actually, in aesthetics already, but it's not really a pleasant one. It's the Larsen effect, actually. I really believe that the way, and I can see it either in painting or installations, actually, we see space-times which are organized according to the idea of the Larsen effect. What is the Larsen effect? It's this very strident noise, which is difficult to bear, actually, if you have it in your ears, which is produced by two sources which are too close one to another. So Larsen effect is created by promiscuity, by proximity, if you want. It's
like two speakers that are too close to each other.
Exactly. Yeah.
And the sound that it generates.
It produces Larsen effect. Mm-hmm. And this Larsen effect is everywhere, I think, today, actually. If we want to talk about the new patterns of representation today, this is something I can find, this collapse of distance, this collapse and this impossibility, these very saturated spaces. I can quote two examples which are as distant as possible, and that's why it's interesting. I could say Pierre Huyghe on one side and Ambera Wellman on the other side. In Pierre Huyghe's installations, for example, you have the organization of a cohabitation between, for example, bacteria or bees, ants, algorithms, all elements which are actually placed on the same level, but actually orchestrated within the exhibition and producing a kind of a kind of clash between different realities, a kind of forced cohabitation between things and beings. You can see that on a totally different level, metaphorically speaking, in the kind of spaces that proposes the painting of Ambera Wellman, actually, who's very interesting Canadian painter, and you can feel exactly this kind of recomposition of the space through shattered elements in a very dense and saturated milieu. But could quote one 100 different examples of this, and with artists working with very different aspects of this situation. It's just a pattern which I think is really relevant today, and it's born out of this promiscuity, which is the situation we are living in actually today. You know, as no other human beings before in different periods of time. It's really the 21st century new situation here. So this promiscuity, what does it produce? Actually, I talked about the Larsen effect as a metaphor for it. But you will all notice that our times are full with this very specific pattern, which is called the loop. And we see loops everywhere today. What was the 2008 crisis, the economic crisis, which is called the subprime crisis? It was a loop. It's money going to money, actually. The Ponzi pyramid, for example, Madoff. You know, what is it? Money feeding money. It's a loop. That's literally the definition of a loop. Already at the very end of the 20th century, you had then here a kind of zoological loop, you know, because the mad cow crisis was actually born out of a loop also. Cows being fed with dead cows, you know, fishes being fed with dead fish, etc., etc. This loop is the second pattern which I think is determining to our times. And I found, and I commented in my last book, Inclusions, which is still not in German and English, but very soon. When Claude Lévi-Strauss, which is one of the authors I really comment, I talk a lot about anthropology in this book, talks about the self-colonization of the human species. As they cannot colonize space anymore, you know, the movement of colonization today goes to human species itself, actually. And you could relate that to the big data, for example. That's self-colonization, actually. The exploitation of a different aspect of the human experience, which is not territories anymore, but the people themselves, actually. Self-colonization of the human spaces. For me, it's absolutely another, which is actually the notion of the loop again. One of the big problems that we as writers or you as artists are facing today is to find an outdoor to what's the outdoor of our activities, actually. How can we escape the loop? How can we escape this art fed by art situation also? That which is for me the definition of postmodernism in a way. You know? Art fed by art. You know? And what I notice today is the need expressed by artists to find an outside, actually. Think about this philosophical movement which was born in 2006, I think, in London, the speculative realism, object-oriented ontology. What do they say, you know, to sum it up very quickly? They are actually describing and looking for the great outside, which is an expression that they actually use, out of, you know, this so human world that we're living in. What's the outside of it, you know? And the answer, for example, Quentin Meillassoux or Graham Harman, is to think about the world before the human spaces, or a world in which there are only objects, the human being actually only a more sensitive object than the others. That goes into the same direction too. That's the the search for the great outside, actually. And I remember that Christian Garcia, actually also a philosopher from this related to this movement, says that it expresses itself, this idea of the great outside, also in sci-fi or stories, because they are also a kind of absolutely non-human possibility also. So it goes into its impacts also the cultural representations that we have at the moment also. There are, if we go back to the roots of this this idea of the end of distances, I found I'm referring also to a great text that was written by Aby Warburg, the great art historian, who actually stayed amongst the Hopi Indians at the very end of 19th century. And this stay not only fed his research on Renaissance paintings, but it also created into Warburg's thought a very specific approach, especially to distance. And I'm going to just wanted to quote quite apocalyptic, in a way, quotation from Aby Warburg, but which resonates very strangely today. He wrote in this text about the ritual of the snake of the Hopi Indians. He wrote, telegraph and telephone, well, the new technologies of the time, telegraph and telephone are destroying the cosmos. But myth and symbols, in attempting to establish spiritual bonds between man and the outside world, create space for devotion and scope for reason, which are destroyed by the instantaneous electrical contact. Mm-hmm. What I understand here, which is interesting, it's that you have two things: telegraph and telephone, the new technologies, which actually are breaking distance, are destroying the cosmos, and the instantaneous destroys the cosmos. That was the theory that Warburg developed actually at the time.
Yes, a short insertion, Nicolas, because Aby Warburg is a reappearing character in our lecture series, and Hans-Ulrich Obrist mentioned him because he grew up close to the sanatorium in which Warburg spent many years under his psychotic phases. And actually, the serpent ritual he held for the first time in front of the patients of the sanatorium.
Yeah, absolutely.
Wow. So there's, for the students listening, there's like intertextuality happening also within the different lectures as part of juxtapositions. So
that's great. I didn't know that Hans-Ulrich was talking about this.
Yeah. So please continue. Just wanted to bring this up that that Warburg kind of is reappearing here.
Yeah, but it's connected. I'm trying to go a bit faster because I see that time is running. It's connected to the general definition of art provided by Aby Warburg. I don't know if you talked about it. This kind of energetical conception of art, because here you listen to words like telegraph, telephone, electrical contact. It's related to the idea, which I really share, actually, and I think it's an absolutely brilliant way of talking about art, that the artwork is a signal, actually, and it has to be described in the terms of the signal. Which means that it's an artwork is an emission from one point to the other, necessitating a distance. And so you understand why I was talking about the death of the distance before. And this emission has to hold the distance of time also. And it can do so according to the amount of energy it deploys. Because every signal, if you want to send a signal, whatever it is, you need energy to do it. It can be the energy of your hand throwing something. That's the basic thing. But any other type of signals from the beginning of times need an energy source, actually. And I actually connected that idea to history of art itself and tried to understand why a painting by a weaver, Albrecht Dürer, for example, or Vermeer, weaver, or Joseph Beuys, to take something more recent. How do those works resist entropy? How is it possible that they are not forgotten? How is it possible that at some point they don't become insignificant, actually? Because so many things become insignificant and are forgotten. And for me, it's related to the fact that an artwork does produce a very specific type of energy that sustains it within time. And this particular energy is exactly, for me, what the Western philosophy has called, a long time ago, beauty, for example. They just tried to encapsulate this notion of energy under a term which was convenient at the time. We don't talk about it anymore, because it's not exactly what drives us, in art today. But the idea is the same today. So I call this energy, which sustains an artwork throughout the times, actually, which makes us want to engage in a dialogue in 2022 with painting by Dürer. Is this energy is a combination of formal strengths, formal, combination, in complexity, because what's really resisting time is complexity. If you send one idea, it will exhaust itself much more quickly than if you intertwine, a very complex set of propositions and ideas. It's the strength of this combination which allows an artwork to go throughout history, according to. It's encryption of information also, because any artwork says something about its time. Actually, and the context where it was created. So there's a kind of a bunch of qualities, actually, which make an artwork. So it's a bit of an historical comment I'm doing here, but it's interesting to see how it's related to the notion of distance I started with, because it's linked, actually. And those are things we have to address, I think, today, seriously, because that's the whole idea of sustainability, which also concerns art. That's a very crucial point. And the cosmos that Abbe Warburg talked about, what was it, actually? It was I see it through the text, actually, as a space which was not full or saturated. A space which is open and receptive, also. A room for projection, in a way, also. Because for projection, you need very specific, and video artists know what I'm talking about. To project something on a wall, you need distance, and a very specific type of distance. The crisis of distance, the crisis of the human scale, and the crisis in general of and this catastrophic promiscuity that's actually happening today are putting all this into question, and I think that could be the basis of a huge discussion for the years to come, actually. So this is a very important point. There was a second point I wanted to talk about, but it's almost as long as this one. So I don't know if you want to get into more conversational
maybe we can
me to go on this
in a conventional format, and you can still nonetheless fit the second point in it. But maybe as a first reaction to, I mean, thank you so much. It was totally enlightening, all the points that you made. I tried to connect it back to the exhibition you spoke about in the beginning that you're doing in Venice this year, The Invisible, and talking about the promiscuity of things from the human and non-human sphere. And you mentioned already in the beginning, with regards to the sublime, the virus, for example, or the atmosphere that becomes threatening. So, in a way, it seems like you're looking at like the non-human sphere, and I thought of, yes, sure, the virus, the atmosphere, climate change, the rising temperatures. This is all sublime in a sense of it's invisible. It's not. We can't really touch it, yet it is massively affecting us. Or the internet, 5G internet, big data, these are all palpable in that sense, yet there seem to be, this is actually an open question to you, in a way, they seem to be nonetheless the driving forces of the world that we live in right now. Do I get this right?
Absolutely, and I forgot to say, but the exhibition will be called Planet B, and subtitled Climate Change and the New Sublime, actually. And it's really, what's important to understand is that it's a totally de-romanticized sublime. You know, it's not an heroic sublime. It's can be also a negative sublime. So the exhibition is structured in 3 parts, which correspond to 3 spaces. The first one is the forest, because anthropologically speaking, just figure out that the first book ever written that we know actually of in the history of humanity is the story of Gilgamesh. You know, and the story is what? You know, the story is just, if you sum it up in one sentence, it's a guy who actually gets out of the city to destroy a forest. I can sum it up like this. It's a bit funny, but you know, it's if you read the Gilgamesh, that's exactly it. No, it's actually fighting the kind of genius of the forest, you know. But that, I think, if you read the poem, you know, it's very ambiguous, and I'm interested in the pattern of the forest as a completely anti-human space in a way. There's a very interesting anthropological insight that I found in the books Scienza Nova by Giambattista Vico, written in the beginning of the 18th century. He actually talks about the beginnings of humanity as, you know, the primitive forest covering the whole earth, and which was the invention, the beginnings of human species as distinct from nature, started there by deforestation, actually. The opening of a space where you actually could see the skies. And when you see the skies clearly, what do you see? You see messages coming. It's called thunder, for example. You see a thunder, a thunderstrike. And then what do you think? You think there's a God up there, and that's the way they invented it. I'm summing up Giambattista Vico's theory. And that's really fascinating, because the idea of opening and destroying your space in the forest to see the sky is the anthropological fact, which number one for humankind. So the forest, as a space seen by the Amazonians, for example, as the space of, it's a social space for most of the Amazonian Indians. The Runa, for example, described by the fantastic anthropologist Eduardo Kohn, have social relationships with the vegetables, the trees, the animals of the forest. So they see completely differently. So that's why the first part of the show is devoted to the forest as a structure, a mind structure. The second part of the exhibition, with some artists will remain, some others will actually be only in the second or the third, comes from a text that's at the very end of the souvenirs of Charles Darwin, the souvenirs of his world tour on the Beagle in the 1830s. And at the very end of the book, actually, he describes the coral reefs as something which is for him very close to the sublime, because the corals are it's super tiny microscopic animals who produce salt carbonate, and their meticulous and very slow architecture resists the strongest waves actually of the Pacific Ocean. And that's what Charles Darwin describes in the book, saying that for him it was absolutely amazing that the minuscule animals are actually producing such a strong architecture which is stronger than any human construction. And so this is the second facet of the contemporary sublime, which is based on meticulousness, patience, long durations, and details. And the third one, the third part of the exhibition, is comes from a very specific story that happened in the 1970s and 1980s. It's a small island called the island of Nauru in the Pacific Ocean, which is super small, actually. But in the 70s, they were so rich that they actually have their own flight company, for example. National, it was the richest state in the world according to the number of inhabitants, because they had huge reservoirs of phosphate, actually. What happened in the 80s is that after this absolutely crazy, wealth that they actually had at this time, the phosphate, was not there anymore. They just exploited everything in the island. There was not a tree left, no phosphate anymore, and they remained completely ruined and the island devastated. This is just a metaphor for another type of sublime, which is even closer to what I really think is the core of the notion, which is the negative sublime. Pollution, extinction, massive effects of negativity, and global ones. So the third part will be quite dark, actually, and it will address this, what I call the negative sublime.
Yeah, fascinating. I was when you spoke about the first section of the exhibition, the forest, and you referenced the Gilgamesh epos, and with him kind of leaving the city and destroying the forest, we come to one of the kind of the classic binaries of Western thought, namely nature and culture, which then resonates again with what we talked about before, the whole notion of the disintegration of the difference between the subject and the object, in particular against the backdrop of the object-oriented philosophy that you mentioned before. And this now, I'm trying to connect the dots basically right now.
Yeah, but connect them very well, because that's exactly what comes afterwards, in a way. And then, if I go back a bit backwards, there's a key element in my last book, Inclusions, which is the text written by Aristoteles 4 centuries before Christ then, and especially in his Poetics, there's one concept that actually has become so natural, between brackets, for us Western people, that nobody sees it anymore. Actually, it's like the air we breathe, in a way. He talks about, it's called the eleomorphic system of Aristoteles. creation, according to him, is the juxtaposition, now here we come back to your title, of a form, morphe in Greek, on a background, ile in Greek. So ilemorphic is the system which considers as normal to actually that creating is juxtaposing form upon background, upon matter, actually. More importantly, matter. So there's one side, the active part, and the passive part. You have always these two elements. But this, if we think about it, has nothing natural at all. No, it's only present in the European mind since Aristotle. But we think it's very natural. Joseph Beuys defining sculpture as printed matter also. There's a few sentences where Beuys actually talks about sculpture and defines it as a mark made upon matter. And if you see the work which is actually currently exhibited at the Hamburger Bahnhof in Berlin, where you are, you see those marks on stones, actually. And it's very interesting to see that this is the core of the Western conception of art for me.
And can I take this even further or ask you, because this is a really inspiring thought, starting with Aristotle and this idea of like form actively being pressed onto the passive matter, because this kind of could almost stand for a metaphor, a symbol of a lot of actually oppressive systems that run throughout the centuries.
So what I write in the book is that this formula is the formula of all oppressions that followed. That's exactly the almost the chemical formula of oppression. Because then we develop passive active, because it's also Aristotle describes creation in physical terms the same way. There's the passive principle receiving the active principle. You see where I go? No. And that's the formula of misogyny, actually, where actually every misogynous speech starts with the idea, for example, that woman is on the natural side. No. That's exactly the same formula of oppression, which is actually contained already in the idea, in the ilemorphism of Aristotle.
Continuing in the colonization as well.
Exactly, the civilized and the savage, for example. They have to receive something from the active principle. And this way of thinking, and more importantly for you guys, this way also of representing the world is not possible anymore. I talked at the very beginning about the idea of a form, a figure upon a background. That's exactly it. That's exactly the follow-up of this idea. Nature as opposed to culture, of course, civilized and the savage, woman on the side of nature, which actually legitimates the patriarchate, active, passive. And you see this dichotomy functioning in a different level and filling up all the institutions and tools actually developed by the Europeans also in the modern times. Descartes in France, for example, in the 17th century, describing the humans as made of two distinct components. You have a body and a soul, and the soul is, in a way, according to him, tele-guided by God, in a way. So we are actually nothing more than robots, and the body has no importance. You can, of course, this discourse was also bounced actually by the Bible itself, when the Bible talks about nature, for example, as a kind of playground for the human being who's authorized to use it the way he or she wants. Generally a he, by the way. So that's exactly this kind of this way of thinking, which is at the core of Western thought, and that's what I try to I try to locate where in today's art this way of thinking disappears and leaves its place to a totally different way of seeing the world and representing it. It's what I call, and it's the very last part of the book actually, it's what I call molecular anthropology actually. Because at some point I'm interested in artists who are not representing the world in terms of products or even objects, but in terms of molecules, actually. You can actually think about, just to quote someone who's living in Berlin at the moment, Dora Budor, for example, is working on molecules. She doesn't see the world in terms of objects or products. She sees it and she can analyze, social functioning throughout the molecules that compose those products, those objects, and those institutions we are actually living in. I'm very interested in artists who actually work seeing that level of reality today, because that's what escapes from the form-matter binomial, actually. There's no form. Everything is a form. Everything is matter. And in terms of representation, it's totally different to think that than to think that you have to place figures upon a background. Everything is active, as I can see this not only in Pierre Huyghe, but also Dora Budor, Pamela Rosenkrantz, many artists actually today. Then everything looks more like a subject than an object. And this extension of the field of subjectivity to the non-human is also a huge political step and a huge political debate, actually, which is at the core of today's debates. I think that the Ecuadorian government in 2009 has considered the soil of Ecuador as a subject, which could actually, be represented in a court, for example. It's alive. It's a subject.
I think this is a movement that's also it reminds me. I think in New Zealand, it's a river that has like the personhood or rights.
Wanganui River.
Wanganui River. Then in Costa Rica, there's a city that has given plants and bees legal status. So there's this kind of, and this kind of goes in line, I think, with what you're talking about, also Absolutely. In line with the object-oriented ontology. And now coming back to my first question, very first question actually this evening, how your processes kind of interconnect and how long you work on them. And you mentioned the Taipei Biennial then from 2014, I think it was, no?
Yeah,
because that was the Great Accelerance, no? The name
Great
of
Acceleration, yeah.
The Great Acceleration, yeah. But that's kind of when you started working on the idea of the Anthropocene, or now Capitolocene, and I think against these binaries of like form and matter and nature and culture and subject and object. So what you're offering is an alternative narrative, basically, that kind of looks at the coexistence, and I think you call it cohabitation and coactivity of human and non-human spheres, basically, in a more, let's say, like a complex understanding of the cartographies of relations, or I think you call it a relational landscape, no?
Yeah. What I tried to do actually for the Great Acceleration, the exhibition in Taipei 2014, my main concern was to set up an exhibition that would actually extend the conceptual stakes of relational aesthetics to the non-human, actually. And strangely, there are many artists actually I talked about I wrote about in relational aesthetics, like Pierre Huyghe, for example, who followed the same path in a way. And because at the end, middle of the 90s, for example, it was too abstract actually at the time. We'd have never thought about it. Every historical period allows you in a way to think this or that. And artists, as much as me, actually, were not so much concerned at the time, actually, by those questions. It's just an evolution, slow evolution. And I recognize myself also in the path of the work of Pierre Huyghe, because it developed more or less in the same direction than mine, actually. And certainly, there's no random here. And my idea was really the extension of relational aesthetics to non-human sphere.
And how does that, this is maybe very basic, but personal curiosity from a philosophical point of view, and how would you say, or how would you define the differences between this kind of new strain of looking at the human and non-human sphere, the kind of more object-oriented approaches, with actually what we would call animism? So the idea of that there's like an essence in objects, places, in places.
Well, animism is a bit different, I would say. Animism is, first, we can discuss, about this notion of soul, which is central to many aspects of animism. Because we could define animism as a system of thought in which there's a difference between the humans and the rest of the living beings, only in shapes, actually. And that's what Eduardo Kohn, for example, describes very well when he describes the Runa system of thought. It can be totemism too, actually. Totemism is a different approach than animism, but it's based on the same intuition that the human being is not the only being which has an inner thought. But I didn't use so much the notion of animism in this book. I think it's not the only possibility to relate to these topics in a way. No, it's complex.
In a way, it feels like you also. It's interesting because you played with the title "The Sublime." The Sublime we immediately connect to more kind of an ecclesiastical context, but what you're proposing is a non-ecclesiastical sublime, a non-religious sublime, and in a way, the animism feels and object-oriented ontology. There seems to be a strong parallels, but without the mysticism behind it. But
concepts and notions like the sublime or animism, they actually have a life of their own, and connected to different contexts, they mutate and they change meaning, and it's part of the life of ideas, actually, which I'm very interested in. And you can actually completely carry a notion from a specific space-time, and if you actually bring it to another one, it will have a totally different resonance to it. So it's not playing with words for playing with words. It's a kind of an experimental way of thinking, to know what happens when you actually do this, and when you dip a concept into a totally different concept in context.
And then I have another question for you, which takes us to a totally different direction, but it's still connected to your work and maybe also to this lecture series. So in many ways here in this juxtaposition lectures, we have been almost coincidentally investigating forms of collage or cut-up as a contemporary model or mode of cultural production. Again, through creative juxtaposition of already existing elements, kind of collage techniques, they disrupt like conventional or dominant storylines, no? And suggest new narratives and completely different narratives. Everyone who looks at a collage sees something different. Last week, we spoke with Candice Williams. Obviously, the whole work is a transdisciplinary collage approach. But then these modes of liaison or modes of connection, they're not only at the core of your kind of curatorial and intellectual explorations, in which, I mean, to quote you, and I love that quote, the artwork is no longer an endpoint, but a simple moment in an infinite chain of contributions. I kind of used this many, many times also with my students. This is from your post-production book. But it feels it's also this kind of, I'm just observing from the outside, and you correct me if I'm wrong, but it feels not only it's in the content of what you're working on, but also reflected in your own kind of theoretical development. So if I look at, for example, the connections or between relational aesthetics, that's the first seminal work that you wrote, the kind of, I think is known to everyone within the art scene, that looks into the, let's say, interhuman sphere and the relationships more between, let's say, people and communities, but it's on a human level. And then afterwards came post-production, where you look, to me, more on the methodology. You know, you questioned the notion of originality, and they kind of looked how artists produce almost as DJ new things out of the already existing. And then came the Radicant that I also love, because it suggests that kind of roots in motion. It's almost like an expansion of the rhizome, but it's more like it plays with that too. And the idea that there is no such thing as an origin, no, but that this is more, it feels to me an argument for multiculturalism and cross-fertilization, and there's no such thing as single origins anymore. And then comes the X form, where you kind of unfold this discourse between what is kind of rejected and what is admitted, and products and waste. And now what you presented us today was this exploration of inclusions, which looks at this kind of coactivity and coexistence of human and non-human spheres. So it feels like from relational aesthetics from 1998 to 2022, the inclusions, there is this, I know it's a perfect red line. It's continuously developing and reshaping the thought and expanding the thought and adding a little bit more to it. But am I over-interpreting, or do you see that too?
Oh, I totally agree. It's as I said at the very beginning, I tried to have kind of organic way of developing and pass from one book to another. The end of the previous one is generally the beginning of the next one, you know, and I always extract one thing and not only develop it, which would be vertical, but I stretch it, or I try to include it in a different, spectrum. Actually, we could actually say that what I'm trying to do is a topology of today, in a way. That would be my ambition, in a way. That's why I'm interested by patterns, and you actually listed a lot of patterns that I tried to address. I'm interested in patterns, but not in mediums, for example, because for me, I don't care so much about the medium that artists use. Actually, it's related to their very specific way of working, and of course it has a meaning, but this meaning belongs to their work, actually, and I don't extend it to a discourse about what's the medium which is the most important today. I don't give a fuck about it. It's absolutely stupid to think like that for me. But the same way, it would be actually defining art, and I cannot define art. Actually, I have many possible definitions which are all wrong, and that's why it's still interesting, because they are all wrong and always insufficient. Actually, so mediums out. It's not the questions, the question at all. Actually, but patterns, yeah. And the pattern you talked about, Radicant, actually, which is an essay about identity in a way, and about the opposition between the two patterns, actually, the pattern of radicality and being radical, which was at the core of 20th century for me, and the Radicant, which, to my eyes, would be the pattern of the 21st century. For at least one part of the world population who don't believe that they have an identity. No, because identities is actually what kills the political debate today. I don't know what my identity is. Identity is something you start to understand just before dying, I guess. I'm not sure who I am, where I come from. I'm not sure I can define myself by being French. What does it mean? It's a series of cliches, actually. It's just terrifying. And that's why radicants refer to a world where the concept of the notion of origins, is diluted in a dynamic way of thinking. Identity is what you go to, not something that could be behind you, that would define you once for all, actually. So I'm very, suspicious about this notion of identity, and I tried to address this question through patterns again. I'm trying to find the visual structures which are behind our ways of representing and thinking. And Inclusions actually describes, which it's a much more anthropological book where there's a constant parallel being made between art and anthropology. But for example, it comes also from the last biennial I curated. It's the seventh continent in Istanbul. Why? Because it starts from an image, again, a pattern. This pattern is what's called the Great Pacific Garbage Patch, or this kind of huge islands of plastic, of waste that you can find floating, drifting in the oceans today. One of them is big as 7 times Germany, for example. You have these huge islands which are called seventh continent. This continent of waste, which was actually created by human activities. So they are perfect, metaphor of the Capitalocene or the Anthropocene. And it's very interesting because it's a new world. Actually, in a way, it's a real new world that we human beings created. But it's a new world which is the opposite of the previous new world. The new world of the 15th century, which was the beginning of colonization, actually. This new world made of plastic and waste, nobody wants to go to, of course. What do you want to do there? But it's much more human, actually, continent. It's in a way, the reverse shadow, the kind of black conscience of humankind materialized in the oceans. And for me, it has a very important role to play in our imaginary world today. And that was the pattern, actually. And what did I want to say about it? I forgot. Sorry.
That's the beauty of the train of thought. I think we came from the Radicant and the idea that there's no origins anymore.
Yeah.
And then how it kind of connected it to the inclusions. Now this kind of connected again to the questions that you were asking in the seventh continent when you created the Istanbul Biennial. Kind of also the pattern of topics that reappear. Again, when you spoke about the Radicant, it reminded me of the conversation that we had with Hans-Ulrich Obrist, who spoke a lot about Edouard Glissant and his kind of philosophy or understanding of kind of archipelagic thinking versus a continental thinking, which very much falls in a similar line of kind of refusing the idea of the radical in the sense of the root that leads to one point of origin, but more of a Deleuzian rhizomatic understanding. And I think that falls in line with what you're proposing as well.
Absolutely. No, that's totally relevant. There are other aspects of it. Well, what I'm trying to describe and analyze in inclusions is actually the fact of being immersed in this world, and how does it transform the relationship that the artist has with his or her environment. To use this term, which is a wrong term actually, because there's no environment, it doesn't exist. With their milieu, with their ecosystem, in a way.
Maybe have maybe two more questions, and then we open it up to the students and to ask. Since we kind of drew this red line from your first to your last, most current piece, it feels that it's another connection or another pattern I do see is like the changing landscape of thought that has been opened up through kind of the internet and digital technologies. So if you think of relational aesthetics or post-production, it's almost quite obvious that this happens in this milieu, in this kind of new milieu of the internet. And in a way, in this lecture series, we're also trying to reflect upon the impact and effect of digital technologies, of the internet on also cultural production today, and such. So this seems to be kind of the backdrop of your thoughts since the 90s already. So kind of what's your take on the kind of effects and consequences of this massive change?
That would be a perfect line, actually, because what happened, in the 90s, I wrote Relational Aesthetics in order to understand what was the common point between a generation of artists with very distinct formal production, but who actually shared something essential. I just wanted to understand what. And so that's why I explored this idea of the sphere of the interhuman relationships. But it was actually this interest that they had for this was fueled by the apparition of the internet, obviously, at the very beginning of the 90s. And the booming of the industry of services, actually. Then the interhuman business was already reifying and merchandising, interhuman relations. And it was the frontier, actually, at this time. It was just beginning. So there was a reaction to it, a political reaction also, from the artists at this time. What's interesting to see now, and the more I develop this idea of the molecular anthropology, molecular art, is the fact that I see mainly the internet as an infrastructure which has a huge materiality, actually. The submarine cables and the hyper-polluting, data farms, etc., etc. What we can see now, 30 years later, is the weight of what was supposed to be immaterial. That's the way people talked about it at the time, strangely. It's nothing immaterial at all. No, the data, the internet, etc., is super material. And what I think artists now are more focused on this aspect of things. What's the materiality of the invisible, in a way? And that's a very important point, actually, because Karl Marx used to talk about the proletariat as the agent of history in the 19th century. I think the main agent of history today is just what's invisible, actually. Which is virus. The virus is the huge agent of history today. The pesticides and chemicals that are actually in our food is a huge agent of human history today. The tear gas used by police, big agent of the history, etc., etc. You could quote 10 like this. What drives history today is absolutely what's invisible. And I think one of the tasks that the artists give to themselves today is to represent this invisible and to deal with it, actually. And it's very classical task for the artist. Since Paul Klee, for example, was just said that art doesn't represent the visible, it makes visible, makes things visible. Still the same. Or power relations, actually, etc. Those things are not visible. They are to be caught in very specific situations. No.
I'm entering a field of like almost free association, but this really fits. And you just mentioned Marx. Basically, the opening line, the famous opening line of the Communist Manifesto is "all that is solid melts into air." So in a weird way, this is totally applicable also to what you were saying right now. No, interesting point. But maybe we can open up the conversation now to the question. Daniel, I think you raised your hand. Did you want to ask your question?
Someone raised the hand.
You can raise the hand here also virtually.
I'm raising it. So I just want to go back to what Nicolas said in the beginning about space and the scarcity of space, or the negation of space in this kind of interconnected world where everything we do is somehow also visibly interconnected to other things, and we're aware of this all the time. And then you spoke about loops and how kind of certain systems of production and cycles kind of don't necessarily fluctuate anymore or move into one direction, but actually just repeat themselves. And I just wanted to ask, in this observation of yours about the invisible and the scarcity or the lack of space, or the lack of, or the like this new metaphysical space that isn't actually a distance anymore, but rather impact. If it's not also relevant to consider the inconsequentiality of like modern actions. So what I mean by that is I thought about Zizek and I thought about Fisher and like these like heavy criticizers of late capitalism that always point out to the absurdities of what we do. I mean, on the one hand, we're aware that when I buy this other thing happens. We're aware of the processes that make things possible in our life. But on the other hand, we don't really, I mean, our actions are so not autonomous. We do it anyway, and there's not much that we can change about these processes that inform everything, or that we're constantly reminded of and aware of when we make decisions and when we go about our daily lives, if that makes sense. Like this inconsequentiality, basically, that is so also funded on symbolism and on things only ever representing something, and on identity ever just being produced and kind of being flat. Isn't that also a lot of space? Isn't that actually the ultimate distance, which is the distance between what I think and what I actually do?
It's very true, actually, and it's not incompatible. I think you're totally right. This gap that you mentioned, this distance, huge distance here, between me, you as citizens, aware of this and emerged into this, absolutely overwhelming situation, and the fragility of our presence as individuals to answer to it. This is a really a distance that actually, exists. And the more distances disappear, and the more this specific type of distance is actually developing in a way. There's a fantastic contrast that you actually talked about between the feeling that we as a species are modifying the earth and have massive consequences on this ecosystem, and the feeling we all have more or less of the incapacity to react to it. And there's a political gap here, which is increasing more and more. And that's certainly the most preoccupying element one could talk about today, actually. And it's not incompatible with Fischer and Zizek, actually, because I'm trying to explore a very specific wavelength of things, which is related to art, actually. But I think you can see the world very well from there. But both Zizek and Fischer see it from different point of view. It's totally compatible and complementary, I would say. It's not opposite point of views. It's looking at the same stage with different cameras.
Thank you. This is also an interesting phenomena, by the way, but this is, you don't have to answer, but I noticed you have a preference to metaphors from cinematic backgrounds. So
you're right.
If you mentioned, or you've
not on purpose. Just not on purpose, but it's...
No, but post-production it's the sequence, not the shot. And I don't know, I noticed. And there's a question that I will read to you. It's in the chat, and it says, "Thank you very much for this inspiring lecture. Following up on the phenomenon in the arts of the collapse of mind and matter, subject-object, or the active and passive part, as I understand it until now, there's also a collapse of the arts with politics, ethics, and also with activism into some sort of specific way of being together. If art could be a transformative agent to expand the notion of the political and to actually change something in how we organize our society, which spaces and practices do you see as relevant to bring this transformation of our thoughts and actions into a broader society outside of the conventional art context?"
Wow, what a question. No. Well, it's very difficult to answer this question. I should let me 6 months to think about it. Because frankly, I'm not sure which part of the world would convey the more this type of energy. I'm not sure which aspect of society would be the most relevant, because in a way we cannot. I tend to think that we cannot think in terms of fragmented society anymore. Every aspect of every society is the totality of it. So if you change little bits of society, it can be as powerful, by contagion in a way, by contamination, than attacking the center of it. I have a more hologrammatic vision of systems in a way.
There's another raised hand by Philippe. Philippe, do you want to?
Yeah. Hey, thank you. Yeah, thanks for those inspiring words. I was curious because I'm thinking a lot about like this dichotomy, subject-object dichotomy. When and you say that it is part of a Western way of thinking, where would you say did it start? Would you say it started there with Aristoteles? Because I'm just thinking as well in the way we speak, because like our linguistic categories of subject and object, as if, I mean, Wilhelm von Humboldt had this theory that the categories of our language dictate the categories of our thinking and the possibilities. Yeah. Would you say it already starts there in the language, or how did this dichotomy came up?
One big question after another, Nicolas. Yeah, God, you want
yes,
there's another sentence by Roland Barthes, in his opening lesson at the Collège de France in the 1970 something, 78, I think. It says language is fascist because it obliges you to say. And so obviously we are caught in the categories of our language. That's why I'm always like to speak in different languages as much as I can. Actually, I don't know that many languages, but it's really important for me to use different ones. I can to express myself at least orally. Then of course it's difficult for me to write in any other language than French. But I can do it in English, but it takes me more time. That's the only thing. But it's true that it obliges you to say, and that it's difficult to escape. But that's why knowing different languages is important, actually, because you are not even knowing them, understanding some notions, for example, knowing that in Chinese there is no equivalent to the word art or beautiful or beauty, for example. The concepts are not the same. So you have to translate, and it takes ages because you have to refine your definition in order to catch up with this notion that you have no idea of, because there's no word for it in your language, etc., etc. So the same way, I think that misunderstanding is a very good thing, actually. It's very productive throughout history. The better ideas were actually invented through misunderstandings. Those people just completely miss the point and think they are doing something, but they're actually doing something else. It's very productive. Just have an example of it. In the US in the 1940s, all the reproductions were in black and white in art magazines. There was no color, actually, and there was not really dimensions either. So many American painters of that generation, actually, of the 1940s, thought that the paintings by André Masson or the Surrealists or the Cubists were super big, actually. And they just thought immediately big. And obviously, it was not the case. The Masson painting is super small, generally. It's very rare that. And when Pollock actually interpreted it, he did it, but he blew it up 10 times, and it created something different, a different kind of space. Misunderstanding. It's great misunderstanding.
In one of our previous lectures, Isaac Kariuki, he said to us, "You always leave room to be misunderstood." It kind of connects well to that. Looking at the time, it's already 7:45, and we're coming to an end. We will not. I'm sorry that I've not been able to get all the questions from the students, but we have kind of this ritual of a final question for each invited speaker to share a final advice, or it's actually a two-sided question. The first one to you is throughout your career or life, what has been the best advice ever given to you? Let's start with this.
Wow. You're catching me here. I'm afraid I'm this kind of person who doesn't really, listen to advice.
And maybe I leave it in the back of your mind working, but then again, as I said, this is a very heterogeneous group of students from all fields, from all faculties, from all disciplines.
Yeah, I can remember a few things, actually. I was lucky enough to but I could not remember exactly one sentence, but I just had really fantastic, discussion at Café Bobo in front of the Pompidou Center in Paris with Harald Zeeman. Actually was very often in Paris. So I learned a lot from this kind of people, actually. It was very important for me to not to get stuck in my generation in a way. And so it was an advice, actually. It was more than an advice, actually. It was also I tried to understand and catch, actually, something of his way of thinking. Also his freedom, its originality, and being confronted to that is more than an advice. It's worth even more than that. It was a living advice, to be, for example.
For the students, you just mentioned Harald Seemann is a very famous, like the first kind of really internationally known curator, Swiss.
It was very important for me to talk with him at the time. It was a long time ago,
but maybe then what I was saying, the students a very mixed bag, so to speak, here, becoming artists, becoming designers, becoming musicians, becoming architects. Like what piece of advice could you give them?
In general, I tend to think that, it's very difficult to give advice, generic advice. I try to avoid that. So my advice would be actually not to listen to generic advice, and only to advice which is provided in the knowledge of your context, in the knowledge of what you're doing, in the understanding, the specific, condition where you're at. Because there's no generic advice, according to me. You have formulas, of course. It's more formulas than advice. A real advice is given for a specific moment and a specific space and a specific action. That's real advice. Anything else is formulas, which can be really good. They can transform into quotations, like Rilke writing to the young poet, these kind of things. But I'm not sure it's very helpful, concretely.
I mean, you have no idea how beautiful intertextual everything is, because Hans Ulrich mentioned Obrist. Actually, this text by Rilke is one of his advice.
I'm fed up of him.
So it's really funny how all these things interconnect.
We created the Moscow Biennial together, actually, in 2003 and 2005 or 7, sorry.
Yeah.
And we actually know each other since we are, he's 2 years older than me or something like that. So we were 18 and 20, actually, when we met. So, of course, there might be a few interconnections.
It's beautiful. So if you don't have any questions to me or to the group, then we would have come to kind of an end of this beautiful conversation that I'm very, very thankful for and very inspiring. I think it could continue for many more hours. That said, a big applause to you from all of us for your time, for your patience, for all the inspirations.
And see you in Berlin.
And I see you in Berlin. Yes, I can't wait. So thank you to you, Nicolas Bourriaud, again. Goodbye to Berlin. And Paris, I see all of you next week again. On Monday, we have actually the German theater director Susanne Kennedy with us, known for a lot of her pieces at the Volksbühne in Berlin and also known for exploration of the relationship between bodies and technology. That said, a wonderful week and see you all soon. Stay safe. Thank you, Nicolas.
Thank you.